Dead Cells. Now there's a property I haven't thought about in a long time. Last I'd heard, our beloved beheaded amnesiac was conquering Dracula's castle and getting a fancy flame cut. But now I hear that support for the game has been forcefully concluded to make way for Motion Twin's new game, which is really rather quite trashy. But class acts aside, you read the title, this video is not about the game itself. Rather, it's about something with a much more optimistic ambiance. The short animated series based on it by French studio Bobby Pills and their streaming network ADN, titled Dead Cells Immortalis. Now, before I begin explaining why I think this series is very much worth your while, there's an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed, because it seems that for a lot of people, especially existing Dead Cells fans, this art style has not been well received whatsoever. People have been calling it pixelated and MS Paint. Me, I like it. I think it has a well-defined pencil-drawn quality to it, and as I will elaborate on in time, its simplicity is actually leveraged throughout the show to make stylistic decisions which I don't think would work as well otherwise. So no, it's not this, or this, and it's certainly not this. This is its own thing. Okay? Okay. Let's begin. This tale takes place in something of an alternate universe from the one you may know, but the main points still remain intact. The malaise is killing everything, the beheaded, now called Flameface, has no idea who he is, and dead cells are still the key to stopping the scourge. The most significant deviation which defines the show is the inclusion of the co-lead Laure Esposito, who, among other things, believes with unequivocal assurance that the hothead she ends up in jail with is the chosen one who's destined to save the world. The only issue for her is that the people who wrote him have a really good handle on who this guy is. He's straight from the game. And while he is voiced now, 1, the performance is great, and 2, he's no less selfish, rude, and generally narcissistic than the devil you know, which acts as a more than serviceable setup for both him and the naive but capable Laure to butt heads and get into more than a little mischief during their adventure to slay the king of the land. Which Laura is doing because she wants to help people, and Flameface is doing because he thinks he's going to get a weapon capable of severing his immortality as a reward. It's a suitably simple story that leads to suitably simple beats, which, combined with the short length of each episode, gives the experience a relatively comic-esque structure. Episode 1 is the prison, Episode 2 is the sewer, there's some episodes dedicated to individual characters, and it all feels very digestible. This isn't a show where you have to think too hard about the continuity, though it does of course lead up to a climax at the end, since everything you need to know is very obvious in the moment it's happening, which is just as well because being subversive when you're trying to pull off a fantastical animated comedy would be rather challenging. And make no mistake, this is primarily a comedy. The jokes per minute here are pretty high, and a lot of it is really lowbrow. Like, it's funny because it's stupid type stuff. If that sounds like it would annoy the ever-living shit out of you, then this show really isn't going to be your thing. But if you're a well-distinguished moron like myself, then that's all the more reason to check it out. All the little jabs and jokes feel seamlessly acted, as far as I can tell, and the subtitle work on YouTube, which is how I watch the show, is pretty much flawless. It conveys everything incredibly clearly without losing any impact, and as the first French language show I've watched, it felt as accessible as it could be, allowing the more conversational lowbrow humour to shine, and the more socially aware highbrow stuff to be appreciated in full. The visual stylization I alluded to earlier also serves to benefit the light-hearted tone of the show by making it easier for the designers to implement some silly stylistic flourishes which would otherwise seriously mess with the consistency of the art and therefore flow of the viewing experience. It adapts into anime action, miniaturized comic scenes, dramatic close-ups, and even some more abstract stuff like straight-up gameplay. It's always doing something new, and I find the fast pace, not just of the story, but of the creative cycle, particularly engaging. I never really found my intrigue in any given scene waning, since it all moves along so quickly and there's always something interesting to gawk at. Now, I want to interject how I've found value in the show with what I know most people are going to be interested in the show for. How much does this really have to do with Dead Cells? If I've played the game, I know the lore, and I'm going to be able to trip this show up when it gets things wrong, am I going to see this as a respectful adaptation of the game, or a largely unrelated adventure masquerading as one from its world? Well, the answer to that is a little complicated, and I think the best way to answer it is to set expectations by just telling you what you might not find particularly palatable. Like, the setting. Gone is the desolate husk of an island populated almost exclusively by mass graves. This world has life in it, or more accurately, as much life as the European Dark Ages can muster, because everything here is rather quite medieval. I think it's reasonably fitting if we assume that Flameface begins his adventure much earlier in the timeline relative to his beheaded counterpart, where things would be much more alive. But do just be aware that it's less destitute hopelessness like that of the abandoned island, and more like the ever so slightly different, but still equally horrific destitute hopelessness of a regular day in the 1300s. The other most prominent point of potential contention is the characters, and I'm just gonna rip the plaster off now. There are a lot of new ones. Laure is of course the most noticeable since she's, the co-lead, but there are a myriad of others who you've never seen before and will never see again, because almost every new character introduced in the show exists to progress the adventure, pull a few gags, and then unceremoniously perish. It sounds cheap, and that's because it is, but the pace of the show kinda demands it. And having so many expendable characters makes rattling off little self-contained stories much easier without having to worry about how they're going to integrate into the greater narrative too much. And speaking of that narrative, the reason that these new characters don't have much to do with it is because those roles are, not unexpectedly, reserved for the existing cast. Flameface, the Collector, Redacted, even the Concierge, who hasn't really been characterized whatsoever up to this point, they all make an appearance and they're all well represented. I mentioned earlier how I believe that the writers have a very good handle on who the Beheaded is, which has evidently done a great job of helping them figure out how to characterize him. And thankfully that fact is also true for everyone else they've chosen to lift. I want to reiterate, these are not different characters wearing the skin of your Dead Cells favourites. They are the characters. And while their tales may be reformatted slightly to better align with the flow of the alternate universe, the way they look, sound, and act, especially the Collector, who does a brilliant job, makes them worthy reflections of the established depictions. Which is a huge relief in a medium of adaptation where properties are hijacked to tell a completely irrelevant story all too often. So, with some understandably valid concerns hopefully put to rest, this is the crux of my recommendation. Dead Cells Immortalis is a show for a very particular type of person. The pace is breakneck, the jokes are constant, the style is silly, and almost everything exists in the name of humour. If you like the sound of that, whether you're a Dead Cells fan or not, you're watching this, so you obviously are, it's almost certainly going to be your cup of coffee. But if you're a Dead Cells fan who's less partial to such a comic style of adventure, is there anything here for you to appreciate, or is the entire thing just going to piss you off? Well, in my humble opinion, I think you should at the very least give it a chance. If not for the writing, then for the uniquely realised take on the Dead Cells world and characters. It's exciting exploring a land which hasn't yet been completely wiped out by the Malaise, and the story of the Collector and his king remains fully intact for you to discover all over again. Bolstered in no small part by brilliant French performances and an art style which I personally find endearing, Dead Cells Immortalis is a very different attempt at an adaptation which feels worthy all the same. And at an entry price of free and a time commitment of no more than an hour and a half, it might just be worth checking out what is technically the follow-up to one of the most beloved indie games of all time. And so concludes my first stab at something which isn't a straight-up video game, though I suppose it is very much adjacent. My interest in this show came completely out of left field. I mean, I used to play Dead Cells quite a lot, I definitely remember getting to 5 boss cells, but I hadn't thought about it recently until Immortalis decided to barrel into my YouTube feed and leave such an impression that I felt compelled to talk about it. In large part because, put simply, no one else really has, and if you ask me, it absolutely deserves some love. Anyway, thank you so much for checking this video out. If you have anything you'd like to comment, I'd love to hear about it, but from me, that's all for now. This has been Rain Reaver, thanks for watching.